Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the University of Canberra National Security Lecture Series. Today our guest lecturer is Mr Chris Jenkins, the CEO and Country Director for Thales Australia. Chris, thank you for coming on a wintry day almost here in Canberra, and can I welcome you to the University on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor Stephen Parker. Today Chris is going to speak on the contribution that industry makes to national security. And I think as the students in the room and many others have found out, national security just doesn't happen. It takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of effort. It requires a partnership involving the whole nation and all of its components. We used to think of security as spies, diplomats and soldiers working to defend the nation. More lately, we've come to the conclusion that it's more about national security as a whole of government approach, and we've included other government agencies such as the AFP, Customs, Border Protection, Immigration and our intelligence agencies. But even with this more inclusive definition of national security, we still haven't comprehensively covered the range of people that have a contribution. Maybe we should be thinking of a whole-of-nation approach. And today we're going to hear about the contribution made by industry. And clearly, industry is a key player in our national security. It's a player at all levels, at the strategic, at the operational and at the tactical. Without the machines of war and the ability to support, repair and sustain them, it would be impossible to pursue our national interests. And by the machines of war, I don't just mean ships, planes and tanks. What about the communications, medical and transport required in the event of a natural disaster? What about the computers and cyber equipment that are the power behind our intelligence agencies? Stuff, and that's a technical military term for equipment, stuff just doesn't arrive. Australia needs a broad-based industry capability to underpin our national security. It needs government to develop an industry policy that is practical and realisable. It needs government to pay attention to the continuity of business and the availability of a trained workforce with the right skills to support our national security. And at the moment, there are problems in all of these areas. And Chris Jenkins, our speaker, as the boss of a very large defence industry here in Australia with an international footprint, is involved in these issues. It's a passion of his. So as well as being the CEO of Thales Australia, Chris is also chairman of the Australian Industry Group Defence Council and many other councils around Australia. And I know that he has some firm views on the role of industry and the type of support that they require from government. And Chris, I'm looking forward to hearing your views and I invite you to address the audience.
Thanks very much, Peter. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for coming along to hear this presentation. It's a great opportunity because for me this is a vitally important topic for Australia, and as Peter says, I am absolutely passionate about it. My background is as an engineer, mechanical engineering, if anyone's trying to guess, but it might become obvious during the presentation. I tend to see all things as engineering problems. It may be a bit simplistic, but I find it helps. I look at cause and effect, I look at the action and reaction of events, I look at the nuts and bolts behind issues. And I hope you don't mind, but I'll be using a little bit of this engineering perspective during the discussion today to perhaps demonstrate some of the key themes that I believe are important around the role that industry plays in supporting defence in its role of providing national security. Now, the topic's a very broad one, and we could spend a good part of our lives discussing it. I've spent a good part of my life being involved in it. In fact, it's one of the topics that is continually recurring around defence, government and across industry. People spend a lot of time talking about it, and it draws debate and it often generates highly polarised views. No one really disputes the need for industry to support defence. The question is really how much and what kind of industry is needed locally to adequately support the strategic needs of our defence forces in their role delivering national security. The debate is long-term and it oscillates from extremes depending on which camp is on the soapbox at that particular point in time. I've got my moment today. So, deep in the defence industry, and I'm pretty deep in it, from time to time you're going to hear we're indispensable. Our skills and our expertise must never be lost. And from the dry economists, and there's plenty of those around as well these days, you'll hear we can buy all we need for defence from overseas, it's cheaper and it's lower risk. There's a place for each argument, but each camp supports its position with apparently equally solid arguments, clear and perfect examples, black and white proof that leaves the public and the taxpayers who ultimately fund national security wondering which to believe at any particular point in time and on any particular defence capability. Each example chosen while supporting the specific argument for a capability leaves a polarised set of priorities, not a clear reasoning as to why this should be a priority. What advantage does it deliver and how should we act to sustain that advantage? So you're not going to be disappointed. I'm going to be providing a clear example just like everyone else does in industry, okay? But look for it. It's not about the example itself. That's not the industrial capability I'm talking about. It's the understanding of why that industrial capability and like kinds of industrial capability are important for Australia. My goal today is not to add more fuel to the debate. After working for over 30 years in industry that supplies and supports defence and having seen the debate over this time, having seen considerable evolution both of defence and industry, and having seen projects succeed and fail, and most importantly, having seen some of the most stark reminders of how serious the work is of defence when it's asked by us to do the very hard role of delivering national security. I want to offer you today the reasoning and a view to resolve what's at the heart of the subject of industry's role in support of defence, or at least as balanced a view as a person from industry can provide. And I'm very much hoping that we'll have a discussion around that afterwards and be as challenging as you like. So let's be clear right at the start. I do believe there is a vital role to be played by local industry in delivering and supporting defence capability. Let me be equally clear, this is absolutely nothing to do with job creation, employment statistics or jobs for job's sake. The single focus of defence industry engagement is to deliver the best level of capability to confer an advantage to Australian servicemen and women and to sustain this advantage over time and be affordable within Australia's budget constraints. And this last point is critically important because whatever we do for defence and the national security goal, we are constrained. Australia is in a unique position in a strategic context, a huge landmass, rich in resources, within relative terms a very small population. And we're in the most dynamic region of economic growth and shifts in strategic balance. Australia's scale disproportion is startling when compared with every other nation on the planet. We have a large area to secure and a small population to do it. And of course our relative economic growth in recent times has been good, but going towards moderate. And we need to be very cautious about what our future ability is going to be to afford the capabilities we need. The point is, we simply can't afford to have all the things we would like by way of defence capabilities. The platforms, the systems, sensors, effectors, the weapons, and nor do we have the vast numbers of people to operate them. So as a result of this unique circumstance, we have to approach the problem acknowledging the constraints. We have to approach the problem from different angles to other nations. We have to be smart about the choices we make strategically and in the defence capabilities needed to sustain those strategic goals, and as a consequence of those things, the capabilities needed in industry to support this. We have to be smart in the choices we make, but we have to make the choices. In doing these things, we must not waste a dollar. We must be clear on what we need, clear on how we will get it, and most importantly, and this is a really vital point to my presentation today, we must be absolutely clear on how we will sustain the strategic advantage of the defence capabilities we source. We must be very smart about these choices. They need to be good for the long term. They should never be reactive and they must not be based on isolated arguments or interests good for the short term but potentially dangerous for the long-term interest of national security. So here's the point. The question of the role of defence industry is often more focused on the capability acquisition and that's not unreasonable. But the key thing I've seen over the last 30 years is that we should be more focused on the question of how we can not only acquire, but most importantly, how we can sustain a capability so that it affords defence a strategic advantage throughout its entire life. For major defence equipment, this is an important reminder, major defence equipment and capabilities, the lifetime tends to be very long. And people sometimes talk about 20 to 30 years, but if you look around, most of these important platforms have lives even longer than 30 years. If you look at the F-111 fighter bombers, almost 40 years. P-3C Orions, 45 years. The Oberon submarine, 33 years. The FFGs, the Adelaide-class guided missile frigates, 34 years. The M113 personnel carriers, 50 years. Throughout the lifetime of these frontline capabilities, the roles they need to play, the missions they do, and the threats they face will certainly change, and we've seen that. The ability to adapt to those changes rapidly and effectively is the critical requirement. The ability to sustain the capability and ensure a performance edge, a strategic advantage, is paramount. And this is really where the linkage to having a capable local defence industry is most obvious. To be really clear and maybe slightly provocative, to be really precise on it, I think there's a lot of people that hear sustainment and understand that it means maintenance. In the context of defence capability advantage, maintenance is not even a minimum requirement. Sustainment of capability advantage means having the understanding deep into the technical core of a capability, understanding the nature of evolving threats, and having the ability to adapt. Without this, a defence platform remains locked in a previous strategic timeframe, perhaps capable of fighting the last war, but not ready for the current or anticipated threats of today's and tomorrow's conflicts. I also want to emphasise that speed in adapting to emerging threats is in itself a major strategic advantage. Conversely, the inability to adapt defence capability quickly is a major disadvantage. Opposition forces have in recent times shown a great ability to find asymmetric advantage through the agile use of disruptive, basic technology shifts, resulting in important strategic outcomes in their cause. Their great speed in taking advantage of commercial technologies was demonstrated in Afghanistan, and it left many coalition forces in very difficult circumstances to respond. Now, having put forward the importance of defence capability sustainment, and having said industry always puts forward a good example to support this, it's probably a good moment to do just that. Now, I've chosen the example of protected vehicles, in particular the Bushmaster. One, because I know a fair bit about it. My company created the Bushmaster, working with Defence. And two, because of its recognition as having carried many troops on their missions without death under serious attack, a record which is unique, absolutely unique, in the world of protected vehicles. Three, and this is my most key point, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say this is a very important defence capability resulting from Australian defence industrial capability. We can say that with confidence today because Australian Defence Forces have experienced the conflict in Afghanistan. I want to explain to you why that is in some graphic detail. I want to explain to you where that advantage comes from. I want you to understand the specifics of how a defence capability advantage was created and sustained with Bushmaster. And the beauty of the Bushmaster story is it's a real-time, complete cycle. We are experiencing it today. And it includes the very real proof of capability that comes from real operational deployment in a rapidly evolving conflict. My point of using Bushmaster today is not to promote protected vehicles as a priority capability in Australia, though I believe that for certain. It's to use it because it has all of the elements of proof, if you like, the mechanical engineering aspect, the evidence that proves how the contribution of industry with defence delivers capability advantage that is sustainable and of strategic importance for the country. And we should use some of those lessons to apply to other types of industrial capability and defence capability delivery to make sure we're making the right choices in choosing the industrial strengths and skills that we need in Australia. The decision to acquire a vehicle like the Bushmaster was born out of the 1990s conflict in Somalia, Operation Solace. The need for a higher level of protection for our troop-carrying vehicles against landmines, ballistics, small arms fire, and the ability to travel at speed over loose sand and gravel terrain drew up a requirement for a vehicle that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. So why do it locally? Well, there's lots of vehicle manufacturers all around the world. Well, for the relatively small quantities planned at that initial stage, just a few hundred, the global interest was not that big. It's an important point. What do you do when your scale of requirement is relatively small and doesn't activate global design teams? For Australia, this is not unusual. The Bushmaster story isn't unique in any respect of this. It leads to an equally critical risk. If you do acquire a small batch of equipment offshore, how do you avoid your capability becoming an orphan technology no longer supported by the distant designers and the supply chain that originally delivered the capability? Australia couldn't get what it needed offshore, so a local supply option was chosen. Engineering knowledge from Defence, the Defence Science and Technology Organisation, DSTO, and industry was applied. Now, I'm going to get a bit nuts and bolts engineering here, and I believe that's particularly important because I want to explain to you what it was about Bushmaster that was so different and what made it so successful and such a strategic advantage for defence. You have to understand what happens during an explosive attack. So you've got to start to have to use your mind here to imagine the environment of an explosive attack. It's not in slow motion. When you see a film plate of exploding vehicles, it's always in slow motion. You don't get a sense of the energy being released and what actually happens. You need to know this to understand the capability advantage delivered by Bushmaster and how it came about. There are three things that will kill you in a vehicle that encounters explosive attacks: vertical acceleration, overpressure, and foreign object impact. Think about what that means when it happens like that. Bushmaster was designed to carry 10 soldiers, including the driver. It needed to be as light as possible and with maximum mobility. And these points were critical constraints. The ability to go off-road, even with loose sand and gravel, maximises your tactical options. You can avoid obvious risk areas, mined or exposed roadways. You can adopt less predictable tactics. You've got freedom to manoeuvre. So it had to be light, it had to have independent suspension to provide the off-road mobility. That was a fundamental aspect of the design. But then that brings us back to the protection aspect, the three ways of being killed in a vehicle under explosive attack. So to vertical acceleration. When an explosion occurs under a vehicle, it accelerates the vehicle vertically upwards, phenomenal rate of acceleration. The occupants can be killed by that acceleration. Internal organs, bones, the spine, all damaged, affected, devastating damages. It's similar, but in the reverse direction, from falling from some considerable height onto a hard surface. That's the first thing. Now, vehicles with flat undersides experience the full energy of the explosion and accelerate upwards at extreme levels. Vehicles like Humvees and Land Rovers were examples of this. You can't just add more steel underneath to protect from that rate of acceleration. First point. To counter this, a V-shaped underside was chosen for Bushmaster. So rather than flat, fully exposed to the blast, the V disperses the explosive energy, reducing the acceleration upwards of the vehicle. It acts like the bow of a ship, if you like, as the explosive force comes up. And nothing like this existed in other vehicle designs for the Australian troop-carrying needs. The V-shaped hull of Bushmaster is a unique feature. Now to overpressure, the second way of dying. If the occupants of a vehicle are exposed to the rapid and massive air pressure increase created during an explosion, internal organs will rupture: the brain, the heart, the lungs. The vehicle must have a pressure-sealed hull and it must stay sealed right throughout the explosion. The hull material must not tear or breach. Now for Bushmaster, we had the benefit of armoured steel developed in Australia, coming from our shipbuilding experience. The build of the Adelaide-class FFGs and the Collins-class submarine gave us lessons that were able to be reapplied. We had access to locally produced steel alloys that are extremely strong and resilient to rapid deformations, as happens during explosive attack. And same so for the welding of the hull. Techniques learned in shipbuilding, submarine building, were refined, and with a great joint effort between Defence, the DSTO and industry, a resilient pressure-contained hull was created that was able to meet the loadings under blast and small arms fire. The same design challenge was faced with the windscreen and the side screens. You can have a steel container, but you've got to be able to see out of it. So we use transparent armour, we call it. It's glass, but it's sort of glass on steroids. It's very, very cleverly designed glass and backed with polycarbonate, and very thick, very strong. It's transparent armour. All hull penetrations, all vehicle hull penetrations for hatches, communications ducts, air conditioning, all of these things had to meet the overpressure requirement, and we did. This was a huge achievement of the Joint Defence and Industry team effort. Every time you wanted to bolt on an additional function that penetrated the hull, this had to be designed in and dealt with extreme care. And finally, foreign object impact, the third killer in an explosion. Anything that enters the hull of the vehicle or breaks loose inside the vehicle can become lethal during rapid acceleration of a blast if it collides with an occupant. And again, the hull needs to prevent anything penetrating the passenger compartment, and everything in the compartment needs to be very securely attached. And this too is not straightforward. Electronic equipment, communications gear, etc. needs to be mounted compliantly to absorb the normal levels of vibration that happen during operation of the vehicle. But it also needs to be restrained in such a way that it can't break free during an explosion. And again, this was fully achieved with Bushmaster. Now, of course, it didn't all go smoothly. It was a very, very demanding project with a very tight schedule to it. Now, as a project, it had its moments, and it tested all of the organisations, defence, industry, all of the stakeholders were tested in their resilience to achieve the outcomes of the program. But there were extremely important lessons learned about how to do local developments better, more effectively, more cost effectively, and with better managed risk. But all the objectives were achieved. All the objectives were achieved, and that became extremely important. It wasn't just another defence project. A war had started in Afghanistan in 2001. Troops were starting to be deployed into Afghanistan, and mines and IEDs were being used as an asymmetric threat that were killing lives very, very rapidly in all kinds of vehicles in that conflict. By 2005, the Bushmaster was available for deployment. It was very, very good timing. Now, at this point, I just want to take a moment to impress on you the reality of a conflict like this. And I'm not a soldier, and I've never fought for Australia, so my qualifications in saying this are limited, and I'm absolutely declaring that. I'm not saying something unreasonable for me to say. But what I have had is an incredible opportunity, and I consider myself to be extremely privileged as a part of the Australian population to have had a great opportunity through my job to work with Australian troops, people who have actually been in the conflict. I've talked to them after events involving Bushmaster, and I've also spoken to their buddies. I've got many, many sobering stories. I've heard the stories, I've heard their experiences, and I know how hard the thing is that they do when they go out and do what we as a nation ask them to do in the interest of national security. I consider myself to be very privileged to have that unique insight. For those people that have been in conflict like Afghanistan, they have a real appreciation of what defence capability advantage means. And it's important for us now, in the security and the safety and comfort of being here in Australia and here in Canberra, to try and appreciate the harsh reality that is defence's work. When we talk about strategy, strategic choices, capability choices to deliver national security, there are realities at stake, there are life and death issues at stake. A soldier's life can depend on those choices. As I say, I'm privileged to have had this experience of working with our soldiers. I get to enjoy the safety and security they provide our country, like all of us here today, while at the same time, by working with them, I've gained some understanding of what they're doing for us. And it's truly impressive, it's truly inspirational. Remember this, so whenever there's a discussion about defence capability, take it seriously. The perspective I've gained, I wish could be shared by all of Australia when discussions come up around budgets, when discussions come up about how defence should be deployed or how industry should be engaged with defence. That perspective of the life and death aspect, the harsh reality of defence's work, needs to be, I think, much further to the forefront in these discussions. In a discussion about how industry can support defence capability in delivering national security, the story of the Bushmaster is a very powerful one. When first deployed, there were mixed views about the vehicle. Was it really needed? Was it over-designed? Was it too expensive? All these things. Many soldiers will admit today that they thought the Bushmaster was not the capability needed. But here's where the story becomes particularly important. The threat of landmines experienced in the 1990s in Somalia had evolved in Afghanistan to the improvised explosive device, the IED. Able to combine an almost infinite number of explosive combinations, triggering mechanisms and methods of concealment, the IED was an asymmetric change in the conflict, heavily impacting coalition forces, with many deaths and injuries in vehicles not ready for the new dynamic of the opposing force tactics. For Australia, the level of protection designed into Bushmaster created a superior platform to conduct an increasing set of missions and roles. As the Bushmaster and its occupants survived more and more attacks which for other vehicles would have been lethal, the vehicle was seen to be a major strategic advantage. It was a relatively safe platform to conduct an expanding number of roles. In total, 7 variants of the Bushmaster were created. From its initial concept as a troop carrier, it retained that, of course, but it also became a command vehicle, a mortar vehicle, assault pioneer vehicle, direct fire weapon, ambulance, and an air defence vehicle. Because the design and engineering expertise existed in Australian industry and the intellectual property was owned by Australia, defence and industry were able to rapidly modify and evolve the Bushmaster to ensure it was the safest, most capable right throughout the conflict. Moreover, with production continuing and industry's research and development work, we were able to increase the protection level of the vehicle, keeping pace with the increasing scale of IED blasts. Now, this is really important. There is no doubt these design changes saved lives, particularly in the latter phases of Afghanistan, where the IED blasts were particularly extreme. The engineering done here in Australia was clever. It was extremely clever. This is not about just adding steel or adding more ceramic. And without going into too much detail and getting lost into the engineering, the protection increase that happened, as I say, in the latter part of the Afghan conflict, the protection increase was achieved by re-engineering some aspects of the vehicle design. Clever engineering using advanced modelling jointly developed by industry working with the Defence Materials Technology Centre, the DMTC, and the DSTO. The design changes could be introduced into new vehicles at virtually zero additional cost. To Defence, the changes were able to be taken up easily without budget impact. What's more, we were able to implement retrofit modifications to existing vehicles to uplift their protection levels at very, very low cost. If we had had to buy those changes from overseas, one, it would have taken too long. That's a certainty, if we could have got someone to do them. The second is that it would have cost the Australian taxpayer and the Defence Department much, much more than they would want to pay. Now, before anyone says we could have bought the vehicles overseas with the level of protection at the outset, the answer is simply no, you couldn't. In 2004, vehicles like this didn't exist elsewhere, anywhere, with the protection level, the carrying capacity, the off-road capability and the relatively low weight of the Bushmaster. And people were dying in virtually every other vehicle at the start of the conflict. By the end, there were other vehicles, but they were much larger, 40% heavier and with less carrying capacity, a significant burden on the operational cost and the strategic freedom to manoeuvre for our forces. So in short, Bushmaster designed, built and evolved in Australia meant we were able to sustain a key defence capability advantage in real time, directly supporting more effective operations. And more than that, the Bushmasters directly saved lives. It's been said as many as 300, I don't know, but based on the number and scale of blasts that the vehicles encountered, the number of vehicles that were very heavily hit by IED attacks, it's quite possible that is the right assessment. And of course, if those levels of casualties had been mounting, it would have had a significant effect on the strategic options available to defence and our government, and not to mention the devastating impact to the lives of our soldiers and their families. On a personal note, the feedback I've had, and all of the team at Talis have had that were involved in delivering and upgrading the Bushmasters from Defence, from the soldiers and from the chiefs within Defence, has been exceptional. And I have to say, personally, it's been the highlight of my entire working life to have that feedback. And if I do nothing else in my career, having been involved in that program and to have had that recognition or understanding that we achieved something great together has been, as I say, the highlight of my working life. So Australian-based industry played a critical role in delivering and sustaining a capability advantage. The ability to evolve and adapt through the life of a platform is fundamental. Failure to be able to do this could have cost lives. It would certainly have limited the strategic options available to Defence to deliver national security. Now, it seems obvious. The Bushmaster story demonstrates it clearly. But what if Afghanistan didn't happen? Would Bushmaster have been seen as an expensive project we could have done without an industry capability that was excess to the national security need? Now, this is important. Not every capability will do something as obvious and beyond question as directly saving lives like protected vehicles like Bushmaster. The strategic priorities for locally delivered and sustained capabilities need to be very well thought through. We can't do everything. For our scale of economy, it's just not affordable. We need to make choices. As a nation, we need to determine what is needed in our industry base to sustain the capabilities that are determined as strategic priorities. None of this is easy. Not every choice will have as clear consequences of life and death as has been the case with protected vehicles. We must recognise, though, at the end, all of these choices have consequences that are extremely real. The choices are extremely important and must be made with great seriousness. Now, in a perfect world, the industrial base of a country will be multifaceted, large-scale, have balanced market shares, not exposed to decline of a single customer, will have the full range of skills at all levels, depth of experience, facilities, etc. In a perfect world, market forces will sustain the skills needed to provide and sustain a strategic defence capability advantage. Now, the circumstances for Australia is that our industry is not in this perfect world situation. We have a limited skills base. The breadth and depth of industry capability is finite. It's strong in some areas, but very much weaker in others. So we need to be proactive in ensuring the skills needed are available to meet the strategic needs. Our industrial scale and free market situation is not sufficient to ensure that all we need will be available to us when we need it. We can't rely on random market effects to determine our strategic industrial skills base. We need to plan, and again, we need to make choices. There's been some work to refine this through the list of priority industry capabilities, the PICs, and there's been many different acronyms to describe the concept. PICs is the most recent. In theory, these PICs should be the roadmap for industry and defence to invest, to activate the skills retention and growth plans. Given the importance to sustaining defence capability advantage, PICs need to be very prudently chosen, reviewed and assessed in light of Australia's strategic circumstances. But they must be made clear, and above all, they must be acted on. As Australia acquires platforms, systems, sensors, effectors, weapons, we must ensure all the steps within the process of acquisition strengthens the industrial capabilities that are deemed a priority to sustain that capability for the long term. If they don't, we become strategically disadvantaged. Priority capability advantage to defence would be severely impacted. So recognising the absolutely critical importance of our country's ability to ensure defence always has a capability advantage and that we can sustain that advantage, and recognising the fiscal reality, there's only so much money we can spend, how can we get the absolute maximum out of the money we do spend. So I want to put forward a few fundamental levers that I believe we can apply to multiply the value to Australia of its defence spend and better assure the ability of an industrial base to exist to deliver on the through-life sustainment and continued capability advantage delivery. First, to my previous point, let's be absolutely clear about what our nation needs to sustain defence capability advantage. We must be clear about how our plans and actions in acquiring defence capability play a role in sustaining that capability. The connection between what we procure and how we engage local industry in that process is critical to being able to sustain the advantage. Whether it's through PICs or some other approach to the problem, we need to plan and act on ensuring the strategically important industrial skills and facilities are available to meet our national security needs. As I said, some work has been done in the generation of the PICs, but much more is needed to make it effective and to ensure the right industrial skills and capabilities are available to meet Australia's strategic needs. Second, we must have an unrelenting drive for efficiency and performance in the way we acquire capability. We must eliminate waste and make every dollar sweat. Defence and industry must work jointly to innovate and create capability advantage in the most cost-effective way. We can do that by learning from our past projects, good and bad. Capitalise on the combined knowledge and action of what should be very mature integrated organisations, defence and industry. Use the lessons learned to manage risk better, and we need to become much stronger in our ability to manage risk in Australia. We should never be avoiding risk or ignoring it or convincing ourselves that it won't come. We need to understand it's there, learn how to identify it early, manage it, control it, and deliver quicker as a result and more cost effectively. Third point, time is everything. The ability to deliver a defence capability rapidly, getting it to those who need it to do their job in supporting national security, is a strategic advantage. At worst, delay can cost lives. Replay the Bushmaster evolution and particularly the latter stage upgrade in protection. Any delays could have cost lives. Speed and agility is a clear strategic advantage. There have been some good examples where this has been acted on. The Rapid Prototyping, Development and Evaluation RPD&E program, the Digger Works program are two. These arose during Afghanistan, so things could be delivered quicker to our fighting forces. As we come out of Afghanistan, will we maintain the same sense of urgency, the same need for speed? We have to be able to deliver speed more reliably and more structurally. Having Digger Works, having RPD&E were great as responses to urgent crises, but this should become the norm. Not only because it delivers a strategic advantage, speed, but it also reduced project costs. And again, in a budget-constrained environment, anything that reduces project costs is a plus. It allows us to engage and get more defence capability generated for our defence forces. The fourth point, when we generate industrial activity in a PIC, priority industry capability area, or any other area, we need to ensure that there is local research and development, innovation, and locally controlled knowledge and intellectual property. This will mean Australia has the skills, the knowledge and the right, the legal right, to evolve the defence capabilities with complete freedom to sustain its advantage quickly and effectively over the life of the platforms and systems. We must have the ability to act with independence and speed when sustaining a defence capability. Again, if we replay the Bushmaster story without local knowledge and the intellectual property, our ability to respond rapidly to the emerging threats of Afghanistan would have been severely compromised. We must foster the relationships between defence, industry, DSTO, universities to achieve the full scale of knowledge embedded in them. We should look at the knowledge we have in country as a strategic asset. It's part of our national security context. We need to connect it better and use it more efficiently. And there are some very good examples. We're seeing some good things work, like the Defence Material Technology Centre, the DMTC, gaining good results. But again, this needs to become a more normal and structural way. Australia needs to interconnect all of its knowledge bases, universities, defence and industry. And the fifth and final point around how to get the most out of what we spend within industry on defence capability. There's an opportunity we need to activate with much greater energy. And given our unique situation as a large continent with relatively small budget, we must use the industrial performance advantage gained by the first 4 levers that I've suggested we pull. We must use these steps to secure a wider economic pool through a stronger drive for defence exports to partner nations. Use the multiplier effect of the global market to further generate local industry scale, the skills and the facilities, and generating greater cost effectiveness for defence, and as a result making industry more sustainable and not singularly reliant on the Australian taxpayer funding. Exporting is a great proof of how cost effective our local industry is in delivery. And to follow the Bushmaster story again, Bushmaster has been exported to Europe, to Jamaica, to more recently Indonesia, to Japan. Over $200 million worth of protected vehicles exports generated, helping to reduce the costs for defence and continue to retain the skills to deliver that capability advantage in protected vehicles. Now, while achieving defence exports is no easy task, Australia can do it. Most people may not realise just how much we have achieved. From my own company, yes, there's Bushmaster, a couple of $100 million, and we're still working on that, but beyond this, there's over $300 million worth of sonar systems exports to the United States and to the United Kingdom. You might not know, but the sonars on the UK's Astute-class submarines, the most advanced submarines, some would argue, in the world, those sensors, some of those sonar sensors, are made here in Australia and are designed and tested and built here in Australia and exported to the United Kingdom. Over $150 million of advanced mine avoidance systems, world-leading systems developed between industry and DSTO. And every year I get to do, every time we sell some more of these mine avoidance systems, I get to deliver a big cheque to DSTO for their contribution to that program. And DSTO really like that. It becomes self-sustaining. Exports self-sustain the capability. In ordnance, 7 million kilograms delivered to the United States in various forms and natures. And get this, over $1 billion of world-leading air traffic management systems delivered from Australia right throughout the region. China, Taiwan, Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, across the world to Mexico and South Africa, done here in Melbourne, here in Australia, smart Australian engineers able to export right around the world. Exports are a powerful ally. They support Australia's defence capability in subtle ways but very important ways, and we need to recognise and more fully activate the benefits it brings to Australia's national security proposition. So to conclude, the role of defence industry in supporting defence national security. It's all about delivering strategic advantage, creating the technology and the knowledge and skills in country to sustain defence's strategic capability advantage. We need locally based skills and capabilities within industry over the life of platforms, otherwise they lose their potency, defence loses its advantage. We need to be clear on what industry skills the country must have, its priority capabilities, and we need to plan and act on these. We need to make the choices about these industry capabilities and with absolute diligence and seriousness make sure they are the right choices. They need to confer real defence capability advantage near and long term. We need to recognise there are serious consequences to making these choices. Acting on short-term arguments or priorities that are not linked to a long-term strategic advantage put Australia at a huge national security disadvantage. Our thinking must be long-term, it must be serious and recognise the consequences. We need to be the most efficient we can be, defence and industry to deliver at greater speed and lowest cost. And we need to do this jointly as mature, integrated, trusting partners. We need to see speed as an absolutely critical strategic advantage and manage and control risk associated with speed using the lessons of previous projects. We need to innovate, develop and control intellectual property so we can act quickly and with independence in response to emerging threats. And we need to get more for the taxpayers' investment in national security by driving harder as an exporting nation with leading defence technologies and discriminating capabilities to partner nations. I'm extremely proud to be part of defence industry, and you can probably tell that from the speech. I've seen some great things done for Australia by defence with the support of those in industry. I never take for granted the fact that we are able to live in this great country with security and confidence in the security and safety around us, and that results from extremely hard, dangerous work by our defence forces. So I'd like to finish by saying thank you to each and every member of the Australian Defence Forces, and I look forward to continuing to work with them in support of their national security role through the strategic uncertainties of the future. Thank you very much, everyone. Now, I'm open to questions on any subject, preferably, hopefully, the subject to hand. As I say, there's 30 years of experience in defence industry. I've worked on many projects other than Bushmaster. That's purely an example to demonstrate my argument about the priority of how we make choices. So please, any questions at all?
Good afternoon. My name is William Kuchera. I'm a law student here. So my question is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of operating within Thales Group rather than, say, one of the British or American groups?
That's a good question. What are the advantages and disadvantages? The advantages, let's tackle those first. I've been in the company now 18 years. I've worked for other companies, British, so I've had the opportunity of working in other industrial environments, if you like. Thales has been a particularly long-term investor in the defence space in Australia, over 30 years investing in capability on the ground in Australia. It started with the Collins-class submarines, with the sonar systems. I was a sonar engineer, a mechanical engineer working on sonars, and I got to know the company through that course. That investment in capability and the strategic view the company had from very, very long range right over there in Europe, looking to Australia, that strategic view of Australia as a smart country, a country with very advanced needs and a high-end player in defence, that perspective said to me and encouraged me to say, you know, this is a company that's going to create some really good things for Australia. And as an engineer, working in a company that's investing in real capability on the ground, not just trying to sell it in from overseas, but creating it on the ground, was a very, very powerful incentive, very positive thing for me. And the company has been committed to and steadfastly committed to that over the 30 years that it's been operating in Australia. In fact, through acquisition of ADI, became very much bigger, and I would argue brought the Australian defence industries, ADI, from a government-hosted organisation to a very commercially active, capable, cost-effective, high-performing company. I will say all those things you'd expect me to, but it's the reality. I've got choices too. I stay in the company because it's doing some really great things. The challenges, the whole world, it's a global market, as I said. Australia has very strong historic and current connections with the United Kingdom, with the United States, and it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. Strategically, there is a sharing, I guess, of more common values in many aspects. But I think Australia needs to be very open-minded in the kind of solutions it seeks to solve its national security topics. And to polarise one way or another, to me, doesn't make any sense, just as an engineer. Australia has a unique strategic circumstance, as I explained. Our local environment is quite different to any other nation, and our ability to prosecute national security cost-effectively with good effect, we should use the whole suite of technologies that are available globally. So having companies like Thales invest in Australia, create knowledge, create access to European knowledge base and skills, I think is a really powerful thing for Australia to have access to, in complement to the strengths it gets in the UK and the United States. And by the way, Thales is a big player in the United Kingdom and also a growing player in the United States and many other countries. Thales is in 50 countries around the world, creating engineering knowledge and skills.
My name's Ian Patterson, and I'm responsible for creating one small part of our future national security capability. I just want to ask, given in the light of everything you've said today and the history of the Collins-class submarines, should we be building the next generation of submarines here or acquiring them elsewhere?
That's a really good direct question. To my lecture topic, if we have the skills to sustain an advantage in those submarines, whatever configuration of submarine we might choose, then that's the key thing. My company, as I said, formed up in Australia 30 years ago on the basis of the sonar systems for the submarine. And I would argue that a submarine's really just a platform to mount sonars on. The fact of the matter is, if a submarine doesn't have a good sonar system and gets heard before it hears the opposition, that's a really, really bad place to be. So it's very important for our submarines to be very, very quiet. It's very important for them to have very, very big ears to be able to listen with their sonars at extreme ranges. It's very important for our submarines to have the effectors and systems to achieve the missions they have to do. So my view is, as long as Australia can access those capabilities and grow on-ground knowledge to sustain those capabilities, to the very core of my lecture, then I think we should be first focusing on those aspects, make sure we have that ability to sustain capability advantage throughout the life of the platform. Whether we buy off the shelf, if there's nothing off the shelf that meets our need, then we need to find a way of meeting our need. Now, it's a lot more complex than building a Bushmaster, a lot more complex than building Bushmaster. And Bushmaster was not easy. So whatever we choose to do with the submarine, we do need to be cautious. We do need to recognise the level of risks and not fail to the conspiracy of optimism that can often run around big projects. The bigger the project, the larger the conspiracy of optimism, it sometimes seems. On submarine, we need to be absolutely focused on where the risks will come from, understand how we will deal with the risks. As I said, we need to learn to manage risks well and understand whether we have the capabilities to manage those risks. That'll depend a lot on the global partners we work with. It'll depend a lot on the local skills that we can build between now and as that project kicks off into the design phase. It's nothing, when we get to the build phase, that's one thing, but it's the design planning phase that's going to be critical, and that's where the risks will be embedded. We've got a lot of work to do there. I didn't quite directly answer your question, and I'm not prepared to.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask, you said in regard to Australia's strategic space, we live in a world at the moment that is complex, especially the Asia Pacific. Nothing seems sure. How confident are you that Thales and to a great extent Australia and the ADF are ready for the challenges of, as you mentioned, more asymmetrical warfare, or perhaps, we don't know yet, the complete opposite, as we are in a very fluid geopolitical space. So how sure are you that we can remain strong?
I think Australia got stronger as a result of the conflict in Afghanistan. I think we had a sense of urgency and direction and focus on how we pooled our resources and directed our actions. In a post-conflict environment, I think one of our biggest risks is losing that sharpness of focus, and maybe some of the lessons. It's easier to have more long-term debates and discussions and consensus and all that, which is a good thing. But if it goes on too long and the country stays in a slower mode of operation, and we lose those lessons that were gained in Afghanistan, then I think we are at disadvantage. That's the first point. So I think there was a very significant gain made during the Afghanistan conflict as a consequence of the actions we had to take. The point about how the region will change, well, I have no crystal ball on that. You can see all of the circumstances, stresses, economic shifts, strategic shifts happening that are of such a scale. I've never lived through that before, and it's a bit like the Cold War and the ending of the Cold War, but it's a huge scale, and so how that will turn, I really don't know. I think what I've seen lately is that people are recognising more and more about being part of this region that we're in, not as a separated, isolated component, but as a very thoughtful, sensitive and wanting to be connected neighbour. And I was up in Indonesia last week at the Jakarta International Defence Dialogue, and what I heard was from many of those regional leads was exactly that context. Everyone gets that, but there are many, many details that have to be resolved, and some of those details are extremely important strategic topic, country to country, not involving Australia at all. What will happen there, I cannot predict. Are we best positioned for it? We're well positioned, but I think we're best if we generate that good neighbour, good relationship, good trade linkage approach. But I think it's good that we retain as much of the lessons learned from this last conflict and try and keep a sharp, focused, speedy edge to what we do in defence capability.
Yeah, thank you. It was quite good to hear you speak today. My question goes to policy acquisitions.
I'll take that as quite okay.
My question goes to the policy around acquisitions. And you spoke before about the requirement for, in developing capability, that we need to look at our strategic requirements and not creating jobs for jobs' sake.
Yeah.
Do you worry often that the decisions government ends up making are more for the political and less for the strategic, and trying to prop up an ailing manufacturing industry, trying to create jobs?
I think we've got to be on guard for it all the time, and I guess my point was to say people lobby on the basis of jobs. That's a fact. You can see that, and I don't think it's the right thing. It's not the right thing to do in the context of defence capability. We need to understand what is the advantage that those jobs, those skills, are going to deliver. If you can't identify the advantage, then defence spending shouldn't be directed to it. If there's an advantage that can be seen, can be, really you can mount a really solid argument around, then okay, that's then worthwhile. It's not about jobs, and I'm not saying it's politics or anything. There are people lobby, and Australia's a free nation, and so it should ever be. But we need to make sure any skills that are lobbied for are the ones that we really need to have in this country. That's the point. Yeah.
Chris Alan Ernst from the SAS Institute. Probably just as a follow-up question to the political dynamic. My question is, what should and could defence industry be doing better to inform our political leaders so they can make smart decisions?
Okay, that's a good one. Hope they read my speech. Maybe I'll make sure they get it. I think having more balanced discussions, and to the lobbying point, it's difficult for people. I've had 30 years in this space, so I've seen the pull and the different polarisation of the arguments. And if you arrive at just a point in time and you hear the loud voices about a particular topic, suddenly you think, well, that's really important. It must be the topic. If you take a longer term look at it and say, well, actually, is that the topic? Is that the set of skills, the jobs that we really need to be engaged in? Are these the sort of right choices? So I think that kind of balanced view needs to be entered into things like the generation of the white paper, the new the defence white paper coming up first half next year, and in that process, it needs to be a true engagement. I'm not saying there's been engagements before, but often I think it's a process of making sure the consensus seems to have been, fair and so on. I mean, there's a lot of knowledge in the Australian defence sector and the defence industry sector that I think now has a maturity to it. The industry is different now than it was 10 years ago. People have been through bad projects. People know, I can tell you, I've been there. Other companies have been through bad projects. We don't want to do that. And defence has been through bad projects. They don't want to do it either. So I think that maturity of the organisation should be brought to bear and used to guide these really important choices and topics, and not have them singular, polarised. This is my interest, therefore I'm going to promote and lobby for that. This needs to be very balanced and taken in the wider Australian strategic context. Yeah.
So, thank you very much for your enthusiastic briefing. I'm Harold Jacobs, the Netherlands Defence Attaché here in Australia. and I want to put some more recognition to what you already told the chiefs in the Australian Defence Organisation gave to your Bushmaster. I used the Bushmaster myself in the mission in Afghanistan. We worked closely together in Uruzgan. And what I want to say is that not only in Australia itself, the universities, DSTO, work together on modifications and test results. We have a very good relation with the DMO, with the DSTO, that we could bring in our test results and our experiences as well. And I want to acknowledge that it's not only within Australia, but internationally with the Bushmaster user group and your counter-IED organization in the defense organization. The sustainment of the Bushmaster, which we have in large numbers in the Netherlands as well, and maybe some more in future, the sustainment will be one of the best advertisements for future acquisition of developing a Hawkeye vehicle or other products. The better that can be done in a good way, in a flexible way, the more advertisement there will be. One thing I want to add, not so much as a question, but as a remark, the Australians and the Dutch were very lucky in our operations that we didn't have any casualties. Because of the amount of explosives used by our opponents. There were other IED attacks with much more kilos of explosives, and even the Bushmaster cannot help that. So it's not the silver bullet, but it's a very, very good product. And just for the information, we are bringing the Bushmaster now into the mission in Mali, so it will spread out across the world.
Goedemiddag, Harold. Goed zo. Hey, I want to make a compliment to the Dutch forces. They were extremely fast to act when they realised the nature of the IED threats. And the acquisition is over 130 Bushmasters now with the Netherlands forces. And for those in the audience, I mentioned that I had contact with lots of members of soldiers and chiefs from Defence Forces, various, primarily Australia. The Dutch have been coming to Australia. Lieutenant Smulders, who came out some years ago and went to Bendigo where we built the Bushmaster, spoke to all the team. It made it very, very real for us when they told about how their families thanked us for them still being alive. And huge inspiration for my team, huge respect for the Dutch forces when we understood some of the conflicts they'd been involved in. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for those remarks. Appreciate it.
Sit down. Say a few words.
Yeah,
Thanks.
sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard from someone who's had a lifetime in defence industry in Australia. He's involved, as we heard, in the engineering side of things, but in the development and the capability and the sales and the corporate side of things. So we've heard someone who knows about defence industry. And I think we've got a really authoritative view of defence industry today. The opportunities and the challenges. Chris, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for putting it also in such an engaging and practical way. And I think, and I'll be part of the Bushmaster fan in a while, I think the way that you've used Bushmaster is the example, not only of the exports and the collaboration with different countries and the different organisations here in Australia is really important. You've truly covered it, the topic from a strategic and an operational and a tactical sense. You brought real sentiment, sense and passion to it, and I think we broadcast should bring passion to it, and I'm sure the audience agree that that's something that we've heard today. I think the point that I take away is the need to have industry close so we can adapt. Things change so rapidly that if you're buying it from overseas, it might not be able to be adapted to the purposes that you want it for. The 5 levers are really important, and particularly the export side of things. Now to be part of the Bushmaster fan club, as you know, I think I was there at the factory for number 1, number 500 and number 1000, and I certainly endorse the fact that many Australians are uninjured and alive because of what Bushmaster did for them on the battlefield. And I'd also make the statement about the workforce, and we talked about having people involved in defence industry and the defence effort being a national effort. one of the things I remember most about visiting the factory, and I think it was the number 500, was to talk to the workers there and tell them that they were part of the team and to see them respond. And there were more than a few of them with tears in their eyes as they understood they were part of this national, whole of government, whole of nation defence effort. And to me, that's the most important thing. Thank you for coming. It's been great to hear from you.